acting member of the board, and it is my pleasure, board of the Ethel Berkeley Crawford Public Library, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. You are our first Thursday night series back in person, and we're very excited for you all to be here, and it's nice to see so many of you. Thank you. Yes, it has been a long haul, but we have made it. I'd like to welcome, I'm not sure if they're on here, a couple of our remote viewers, specifically Mark and Sari Feldman. Tonight's program is our annual Minnie Feldman Memorial Lecture in honor of their mother. And it is their donation that makes this program possible. I'm also embarrassed to admit I've been on the board here for probably close to 30 years. I never knew why we gave a Minnie Feldman program honor every year until what happened was earlier this year, Sari Feldman, one of the people who donates this, wrote a letter to, I don't know if you're familiar with the New York Times Metropolitan Diary. It appears in Sunday's New York Times. And she mentioned that she was from South Baltimore, New York. So I asked my friends from South Baltimore, do you know this person? And they said, oh yeah, that was Minnie Feldman's daughter. And I went, Minnie Feldman? Now I know. And then I found out how she came to use our library. And so we do want to thank Mark and Sari and their family for doing this every year. And I can't think of a better person to be honored than Tony Nappo. And so that does bring up this year's recipient of the Minnie Feldman Program Awards, Tony Nappo. Tony, as many of you know, is here, is a 40-year career educator who has experienced teaching at the elementary, secondary, and undergraduate and graduate levels. He received a BA in history from John Carroll University, which is in Cleveland, Ohio, if you did not know. I'm an Ohio girl. And an MA from John Carroll's Institute for Soviet and East European Studies in 1976. He also holds an advanced certificate from the Center for Comparative Totalitarian Ideologies at the University of Colorado at Boulder, as well as another MA in instructional technology from the New York Institute of Technology. Tony taught at Middletown High School for 30 years, where in addition to teaching honors world history and AP US history, he developed, introduced, and taught courses in Russian Soviet studies, international politics, and futuristics. Tony has enjoyed presenting book talks and lectures at our library since 2015. We were still in the old building for his first one, and he tells me he always looks forward to coming here. I said this before, and I'll say it again. Every year when I hear Tony speak, I'm awed by his knowledge, his ease of presentation, and every time I rue the fact that I'm as old as I am and was never able to have been a student in one of Tony's classes. So there you have it. Without further ado, I think Mary Page, our director, wants to say something.
I just want to let everyone know that this is going to be streamed on the library's live on the library's YouTube channel. So I just wanted you to be aware of that, and it will be there available to the public afterwards as well.
And if you have not subscribed to our YouTube channel, you can do so easily and get all of our YouTube presentations. As long as presenters approve of their being on YouTube, we will continue to post them there. So without further ado, let's give a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Nice to see everyone in person. The last time we were all together was July of 2019. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It's wonderful to be here again. Thank you, Lynn, for that lovely introduction. And Thank you, Mary Page and the board. Thank you to the Feldman family. This is a bit of a new experience to be doing everything hybrid and on YouTube. When I suggested to Mary Page that I was going to look at this title and come up with this idea, I could almost hear a sigh at the other end of the phone and a question like, oh my goodness, do we really want to try to take on this broad of a topic? And so I want to say thank you for having the confidence that we can do this and still manage to get through everything correctly. For everyone that's online, Zooming live stream, hello, welcome. I understand too, there's a possibility this may be going to the White House and the State Department. So I just want to let you know, I took the test for the State Department 45 years ago, and I was on a waiting list and I haven't heard anything. So President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken, you know where to find me, and you know my number and email, I'm sure. Okay, let's get started. Before we go any further, how many of you, raise your hand, had history as your favorite subject? Enjoyed history the most? Okay, everybody else, you're taking the quiz. Okay, so this is a pretty broad topic this evening, but I think it's appropriate and especially important. And as soon as I can get the technology to kick in, we're good. We're good. Let's all start with something hopefully we can agree on without any debate. In 1944, a Swedish Nobel Prize winning economist and sociologist published a study on the United States, and he called it the American Creed. And in this American Creed, basically what he did was describe what he felt were the most significant characteristics of what made America great. And this is the very, very first piece of that American Creed that were devoted to the principles of liberty, self-government, equal opportunity for all ages, regardless of race, gender, religion, or origin. So clearly, that's an American ideal. So if I were to ask each of you to, in your mind's eye, try to come up with a picture of what you felt represented your American ideal. Today? Whenever, sure, right? Let's focus today. I decided, because my wife and I were in Stockbridge over the weekend, and we stopped and had lunch in Stockbridge, that Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms would be a perfect introduction for what we want to talk about. These were the four freedoms that were outlined by Franklin Roosevelt in his inaugural address in 1941, and they speak to the notion of the American Creed in the sense that we have the freedom of worship, freedom from fear, freedom of want, and freedom of speech. Each of us has in our mind's eye the notion of what America represents. Unfortunately, right now at present, this is a different world. And I chose these particular snapshots to try to illustrate the reality of where we are and where we need to be. In the upper right-hand corner in 2017, that was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville that was described by someone as having very fine people on both sides. On the left, obviously, or on the lower left, are demonstrations after the George Floyd killing in 2020. In the upper left-hand corner is, of course, January 6th. And I'll make sure that we wrap this up so everybody has time to get home this evening to watch the inaugural public hearing of the committee. And in the lower right-hand corner, unfortunately, is the nightmare that just unfolded in Texas last week. So for our purposes this evening, we're going to have three chapters. The first chapter is pretty simple. And when you look at those two different slides, you can see what we're pointing to. It's essentially who are we? Who are we relative to our ideals? And how do we define the common good? Because that's a pretty critical issue if we're going to go forward together. The second chapter that we're going to look at tonight are 5 challenges that I think all of us have to be aware of as we go forward, because as a country, they need to be addressed. They're in front of us, and I hope to crystallize things for you so that people have a better understanding of what's out there and what needs to be addressed. And perhaps most importantly, at the very end, we're going to present an action plan. So in other words, instead of just talking the talk tonight, when you leave, I'll hopefully give you enough ammunition to be able to go home and walk the walk and have an action plan to actually take on things. Now, as you can tell from the introduction, after 40 years of teaching history, we're going to start with history in the sense of a context, because we can't really understand issues today without understanding the context in which they exist now, where they're coming from, and what we can reasonably expect that they'll lead to. So this, I like to present this notion as the study of history as a conversation, because we can always look back and find lessons and find themes. I always used to tell my students it's frequently necessary that you have to take one step backward or take two steps forward. So we're going to start by looking at a definition of the common good. What I'm going to do this evening is, as we go through this, I'm going to introduce you to some authors. I know there's a reading list up on the table. As we go through this, or as you leave, you're welcome to take that. Most of the people you're going to see up here this evening are on the reading list, but I cheated and threw in some new ones that aren't there, so feel what's going to be online, so you can go see it anytime you want.
I just handed it out to everybody here.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
My marketing group. Thank you.
I think we ran out, so.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. So the first gentleman we're going to introduce you to is Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor and an author of a number of books, mostly focusing on economics, but this one is specifically titled The Common Good. And we're going to join up with a really, really special guy. His name is Michael Sandel. And I like this guy very much. He's one of the, if not the most popular undergraduate professor at Harvard. He's especially famous for a course in justice. And if you Google his name, Michael Sandel, you can actually take the course online for free. And you can sit there with all the undergraduates in this big lecture hall and go through his course on justice, which is absolutely spectacular. And he also is going to give us some background on what we mean by the common good. So we're going to put Robert Reich together with Michael Sandel and join them up with, obviously, James Madison. And the reason is very simply this. If we're going to look at the common good and where we are as a country, we need to start at the beginning. And there's no better place to start than with James Madison and the founding fathers and the writing of our Constitution. One of the things that's going to become something that I mentioned a lot tonight is how the founding fathers based a lot of what they wanted to see in our country on the notion of virtue. And their definition of virtue was essentially citizenship, the right kind of citizenship. And they felt that virtue was necessary to safeguard our freedoms and our liberties. And that the virtue that they were looking for was especially important in order to achieve a common public good. So much so that in the Federalist Papers, James Madison, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, very specifically said that in order for our country to reach its full potential, we need the people to intend the public good. That intent is the emphasis in the original text of the Federalist Papers, meaning the government is there to protect the common good. And what Madison and the founding fathers were talking about is something that political scientists describe as the virtuous circle. A virtuous circle is based on civic trust, which means that it's self-enforcing, self-perpetuating. It means that when things are going well, everyone is doing well. And when everyone is doing well, you have less chance for demagogues and wannabe dictators and people that are anxious to do their own thing and take our rights away. The more acceptance of the common good, the more resistance there are to disruptions of the common good. The opposite of a virtuous circle is obviously a vicious cycle or a vicious circle. That's where you have demagogues who promote fear and anger and resentment toward the other. The other is picked from a menu. Whatever it may be on that day that they feel can get them people and can get their followers riled up, that's what we call the vicious circle. So Madison sat in his library in Montpelier in Virginia. You can see him sitting there. Obviously, that's a little cheesy, but that is his library. And it's really remarkable when you visit that room because you can sense that Madison spent a lot of time thinking about this. And the story that the guys tell is that he would literally get crates and crates of boxes of books delivered from Europe to find out from the Enlightenment thinkers what is the best type of government. When he was doing that, and he was describing and he was building the Constitution, one of the things he warned about was the rise of things that he called factions. Factions were groups of people, groups of citizens who placed their own self-interest above the country's interest. This is James Madison at the end of the 18th century. So the Federalist Papers, for all intents and purposes, anticipated the rise of what we today, psychologists or social scientists, would refer to as the social identity theory, which is damaging to the common good. The social identity theory basically boils down to this. All of us like to be part of groups. We identify with groups. We like to, and that identity could be gender, it could be race, it could be political, it could be sexual preference, it could be religion, political beliefs. That's our social identity. And that breaks into or down to in groups versus out groups. So I know this is perhaps making light of it, but I threw the Yankees and the Red Sox. The notion being that the dynamics of this social identity theory creates conflicts that become almost tribal in their identities. And when they become more tribal, what it does is it masks the fact that we may have actual policy similarities, but because we have our tribal identities, that gets lost. Members of the group will make non-rational choices and tolerate inferior outcomes as long as they get the emotional satisfaction of winning. You've heard the phrase, we have to own the libs. Well, and we all know people that flabbergast us because we can talk to them and we can agree on so many issues, and then they'll go and they'll pull a lever for someone that represents the exact opposite of what they want. And it's because of their social identity. What we have to try to do is move out of this zero-sum politics, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight, where individuals in each group develop these feelings of prejudice and anger and pride as toward the out-group, as well as pride and loyalty toward their in-group members. Because frankly, the exhausted majority, that's a phrase that now political scientists are beginning to use, the exhausted majority is looking to reestablish that common good. So getting back to Madison, Madison said we have to go and create fundamental principles. And he read everything, but most especially he read a lot by these three guys. In the upper left-hand corner is John Locke. Next to him is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And at the bottom is a guy named Montesquieu. These were Enlightenment thinkers. And in the end of the 18th century, Madison and Hamilton and John Jay and the others were sitting around. They really were inventing a new type of government. This had never been done before. And they were trying desperately to find ideas from wherever they could find them. From these three men, they created these ideals. All men are created, notice, all men are created equal and have unalienable rights. But the three themes that are key to what we have to remember today: social contract, consent of the government, and separation of power. Social contract is unique because this is something we're going to emphasize again and again. Citizens surrender some freedoms to secure rights for the greater good. The next time you hear someone somewhere say, well, I'm simply protecting my freedom. I have the freedom to do this, or I have the freedom to do that. Remind that person that that freedom comes with responsibility. there's a second part to that statement. It's not just I have freedom, but there is responsibility. That's the social contract. Consent of the governed is that power rests with the governed, and separation of power is unique primarily because of the fact that it rests with courts to enforce. And if you lose control of your courts, then you have difficulty losing power, losing your freedom and liberty. When we talk about this, what we're looking at these founding fathers is saying they have the genius to understand the political tensions between two underlying forces. On one hand is a brutish state of nature. That's Thomas Hobbes, another British writer and British political philosopher who had lived through the British Civil Wars. And if you want to talk nasty civil wars, the British or the English were beyond anything we could possibly imagine. And instead of being in that brutish state of nature, citizens will surrender some select freedoms. The tension is constantly where the government has to adjust and protect freedom, but at the same time protect everyone. You can have some liberty, but we have to protect everyone's freedom. That's the tension. And that tension is built in by design to be fluid and constructive. The easiest way to realize that is that the Constitution that you're holding has 27 amendments. It's meant to be a fluid document that can be amended. We distributed to each of you a really handy copy of the Constitution. That's a really nice one. That's courtesy, by the way, of Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney's office. I like that particular version primarily because it has not just the Constitution, but it also has the Bill of Rights. It has 27 amendments, the Declaration of Independence, but most importantly, it has an index in the back, which is particularly useful when you're trying to find a right. So these documents are the foundation of what we're calling the common good. So now let's move forward. How can the government promote the common good? So we have to answer some questions. Who does our government serve? That sounds pretty simple, but in reality, it's very, very complicated. Does it serve the wealthy? Does it serve a certain race? Does it serve a certain religion? What's the proper scope of government? How much do we want the government involved in controlling what we're doing? How does the government best serve the common good? And we're going to look at waves of American history very, very generally to see how the common good has developed in different time periods and in different ways. So let's start with this young man. This is a political scientist named Robert Putnam, who wrote a book called The Upswing. And he is one of the folks that tries to get a big picture. And when I was teaching, let me ask you this question. How many of you were the type of student that when you sat in social studies class, let's say American history, and you had a unit on colonial America, and you took a test, and then the next unit was going to be on, let's say, Introduction to the Civil War. And as soon as you took the test, you forgot about all that stuff and say, okay, let's now focus on the Civil War. And when the Civil War was over, you went to, let's talk about early 20th century. And you forgot all about Civil War. Students do that. They tend to just compartmentalize. And I was constantly trying to tell my students, no, you can't do that. And I would come up with little tricks, like try to think of history as a series of waves. If I put you in a beach and said, count the waves, no one's going to come up with the same number because it's fluid. I would suggest, okay, history is like a rainbow. It isn't compartmentalized, it blends together. Another one would be, okay, history has cycles. That's Arthur Schlesinger's big deal, that there are cycles in American history. Or that there's a pendulum effect. This is what Robert Putnam does. And what he says is there are cycles of American prosperity that reflect the common good. And I know that as soon as I put a graph up, my eyes will begin to glaze over too. But this is very, very simple. And what he did was he measured economic, political, social, and cultural trends for the past about 125, 130 years. And what it showed very simply is that America has gone through cycles. At the end of the 19th century, how many of you have been watching The Gilded Age on HBO? Okay. The Gilded Age was a period of great inequality. And if you were a plutocrat, and if you were one of the wealthy that had a cottage on Bellevue Avenue in Newport or on the avenue down in Manhattan, you were doing very, very well. But it was, as Robert Putnam described it, I period. Wealth was concentrated in just a small group of people. The focus was on the individual, the very rich, wealthy individual. But then, as we went through, we had the progressive era in the early 20th century. We hit a peak around 1945 to 1965, to 1968. It's called the Great Compression, where America hit the we period, where there was this great, great acceptance of the common good, otherwise known as the greatest generation, that came together where we had the greatest economic equity. We had political progress where there was bipartisanship. We had generous social welfare programs. And the cultural trends were, with certain obvious exceptions, basically directed toward bringing the country together and creating a common fabric. That fabric unraveled after 1968. And it really hit the accelerator in 1980. And we've been, since 1980, full speed back into the me generation and away from the we mentality. So that's what is meant by the common good and ways. So what we're going to try to figure out is how can we get back to the we mentality where we're together and promoting the common good. Well, we have 5 challenges. So these are the 5 challenges we're going to look at very quickly tonight. The first challenge is social dislocation and racial divisiveness. Actually, Mary Page and this, each one of these is a separate presentation by itself. The second challenge is economic inequality and free market abuses. We're going to try to figure out how to overcome those. The third challenge is how to manage globalization and all the consequences of the technology revolution. Obviously, tonight we're going to spend a lot of time on political polarization and what some folks are referring to as the American schism. And if we don't get our stuff together, we're going to have a real problem confronting the rise of authoritarian populism. That's the worst case scenario, and that's what we truly have to be aware of. So that's where we are headed. Let's do number 1. Social issues and the common good, and once again, this goes back to Gunnar Myrdal and his proposal of the common good. He said that the genius of America lies in its capacity to forge a single nation from peoples of diverse racial, religious, and ethnic origins. E pluribus unum, from many one. It's hard to take a snapshot of America right now and think that Myrdal could come back and say they're there. Right now, I don't know that we would feel comfortable in living up to this ideal. What we're trying to answer is simply, who is an American and what are we to one another? These 2 authors are exceptional in their approach to these questions. On the left is Heather McGhee, who wrote the book called The Sum of Us. On the right is Isabel Wilkerson, who already won numerous awards for her earlier book called The Warmth of Other Suns, which talked about the Great Migration. This book is her most recent, called Caste. And I'm sure it's interesting that if you went up to just a general American student and said, if I talk about caste in history, what are you talking about? What comes to mind? And they'll say India. We're going to talk about caste right here in America. So first thing, what these authors do is they address the issue of polarization in demographics. These are facts that are the reality of where we are today. By 2045, non-Hispanic whites will no longer be the majority. 2060, the only group projected to shrink in size is the non-Hispanic white population. Today, white deaths outnumber white births in 26 states. In 2018, 4 years ago, when surveys were taken, No religion was cited more often than Catholic or Protestant evangelicals. There is an amazingly distinct increase of secularization in our country, a diminishing of evangelical and religious influence in political conversations. 7 out of 10 seniors are white and Christian. Fewer than 3 out of 10 younger adults are. These are demographic realities that America and we have to come together and figure out how to handle. Tension is developed due to caste and social stratification. These 2 quotes come from Ezra Klein and his book, Polarization. Why are we polarized? And for the Ezra Klein used to be on MSNBC, now he's a columnist for the New York Times. And I thought they were especially appropriate for what we're talking about in terms of caste. There's nothing that makes us identify with our group so strongly as the feeling that the power we took for granted may soon be lost on one end, or on the other side, that the injustices we've long borne may soon be rectified. If you want to talk about tension and how government has to address 2 sides of issues, that's exactly what we're talking about there. And this is an especially insightful comment. When you're accustomed to privilege, equality may feel like oppression, which explains people feeling threatened, people being resentful, people being fearful. So America has a problem with caste. And caste is an artificial construct that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups. And it'll use rigid, arbitrary boundaries to keep those ranked groupings apart. At its base, it's about power, resources, and respect. And caste doesn't have to just be racial. Caste is gender, caste is religious, caste is economic, caste is all of the above. There are 3 things that I wanted to get out right out of the chute that have to do with social dislocation and social issues. And are cause for lots of questions and misinformation. Number 1, you've probably all heard about the 1619 Project. And many of you may not know exactly what it is. So let's clarify. 1619 Project was started in August of 2019 by the New York Times, actually staff of the New York Times Magazine. And it was meant to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia. The basic thesis, the basic theme of the project was that we're going to look at the history of America from the arrival of these African slaves as the real focal point, fulcrum for the birth of our nation. And that the introduction of slavery in 1619 has ultimately been the thread that's woven consistently through American history. We can't get away from it. That's what the 1619 Project is all about. The second thing you've probably heard about frequently is critical race theory. What is critical race theory? If you go to a certain cable station and listen, they will send you into the streets screaming that critical race theory is going to take over our schools. Critical race theory is an academic and interdisciplinary approach to investigate the roots and dimensions of systemic racism. It's based, and it was it's based upon investigating institutions, systems, and programs that contribute to systemic racism. It was started in the late 1960s and developed in the 70s by a bunch of law professors. It was designed primarily for postgraduate and law school programs. That's what critical race theory is meant to, where it's meant to be developed. There is no formal CRT syllabus currently or curriculum for any K-12 education. Do schools teach slavery, about slavery? Do schools teach about the history of slavery? Do schools teach about racism in American history? Yes, that is not necessarily critical race theory. That's simply called history. And then I really debated putting this one up. But if we're going to talk about great replacement theory, as of right now, this moment, it's synonymous with said individual. The great or white replacement theory that is now being promoted is a white nationalist conspiracy theory that was originally developed in 2010, around 2010, by a French author named Renaud Camus. And the original theory states, and it was a reaction to immigration in France. And he was seeing many Muslims or many non-white immigrants coming into France. And he said that with the complicity or cooperation of replacist elites, white European populations are being demographically and culturally replaced with non-white people. Transpose that to the United States and that individual and transfer it from African or Middle Eastern immigrants to people coming in from Central and South America. And you get the notion of the white replacement theory. We'll come back to that in a second. These two authors look at all of that. Heather McGee, Isabel Wilkerson, and they say what we need today is to focus on the sum of us together and the common good. What America needs today is to replace caste with a new sense of civic empathy. By 2045, people of colors will become the majority in the United States. We have to therefore replace this zero-sum paradigm, white America for white America, with instead something that Heather McGee has called the solidarity dividend. Look at all the things that we can bring together for everyone to benefit so that it's a win-win. Racism means everyone loses. There's inequality for everyone. Racial resentment underlines how public benefits can be distributed. Racism costs everyone and limits how we can prosper together. This is an absolutely amazing example of what that means. In the early part of the 20th century, there was a huge movement to build public buildings, especially in the early 20th century, the progressives. In fact, in 1912, there were 4 presidential candidates, all 4 were progressives. And one of the manifestations was a building boom to create public pools and public libraries. So this pool, it's a postcard, is the Fairground Park Pool in St. Louis, Missouri. It was the largest public pool in the country. In 1949, though, rules were changed and it was desegregated. It was integrated. By 1956, the pool was closed. So it went from over 300,000 swimmers per summer to 0. That's what is meant by zero sum versus the solidarity dividend or the sum of us. If racism is allowed to permeate our public programs, we all lose. It's not just those folks that are being segregated against. Systemic racism exists in the context of caste. These are just basic statistics which we can quickly go through. I've seen these probably frequently, but when you put them all together, it really completes the picture. A wealth gap, median net worth for a white family 10 years ago was 134,000. The median net worth for Hispanic is 14,000. For a black family, 11,000. Employment inequities. For the last 60 years, black unemployment is twice as high. Housing discrimination. And for housing discrimination and systemic racism, think redlining. Redlining was the process whereby city planners, think of Robert Moses, the power broker in New York City, would literally draw red lines on the map. And that is where they would consolidate lower income minority housing and build everything else around it. Housing discrimination, where you live, can decide everything from how safe you are to what food you eat, quality of health care, quality of your job, quality of your children's education. And then incarceration, out of every 100,000 Americans, 700 are out of every 100,000 white Americans, 700 are incarcerated, but out of every 100,000 black men, 4,000 are incarcerated. This is what caste in America means. So the question then becomes, well, let's flip it. Where can we see the benefits of this solidarity dividend? We can see it in public education, preschool, childcare, K-12 civics education, public universities. We can see it in healthcare and retirement securities. If we get healthcare for all, fair housing and financial lending, workers' rights and better jobs, and most importantly, extending voter rights and protections for people of color to get more say in political situations. Those are examples of the solidarity dividend. We then can segue right into economics and the common good. Once again, our good friend Gunnar Myrdal looks at the economy and economics and the solidarity dividend, and he says, the American souls believe all men are created equal. This is important. We cannot guarantee equal outcomes, but we can try to ensure equal opportunities. And a good quote from former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis: we can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. Therefore, let's check out these two authors and economists. On the left is a woman who is currently working in the White House. Her name is Heather Bushey. Her book is called Unbound: How Inequality Constricts Our Economy and What We Can Do About It. And on the right is probably my favorite, and I think the greatest economist around now, Joe Stiglitz, who has made an entire career of documenting inequality. When they look at inequality and they work with people like Michael Sandel at Harvard, they come up with something called the tyranny of meritocracy. When you hear the phrase meritocracy, sounds good. Sounds like a positive idea. A meritocracy means you earn it. Where you get what you earn, and that's a good thing. The question becomes, though, did you get a head start in what you had the opportunity to do? Did you get a head start in your opportunity to merit that? The tyranny of meritocracy can erode the bonds that create common people. Economic gains for a small percentage of Americans leads to frustration, disengagement, and vulnerability. Question: do we have wealth for all? And this is a take on Mitt Romney's favorite quote: corporations are people, my friend, when he was running for president a number of years ago. No, corporations are not people. What we're looking at is a redistribution of wealth, but the redistribution of wealth has been up. It hasn't been broad-based. Subsequently, we have a vicious circle where more Americans are left alone. Large corporations and wealth accumulate more assets. With that comes more political power. And we all know that the Citizens United case and the idea of dark money, money that comes in without being attributable, leads to distrust in government of the people. In other words, it's bought and paid for. What that then leads to is what Thomas Friedman is the first person I saw coin this phrase: a poverty of dignity. And that's a quote from Nelson Mandela: that abject poverty is demeaning. It's an assault on the dignity of those who suffer it. And in the end, it diminishes and demeans us all. It makes the freedom for all of us less meaningful. And the elites, meaning those of us who have a say in government and have or know people in government, have to recognize that they bear the responsibility for creating these conditions that have eroded confidence. Political failure leads to a lack of connection to the common good, and that there are too many of our fellow Americans who feel that they are the losers. And they're out there doing what they think is supposed to give them the merit, and it's part of a meritocracy, but they're not winning. That represents a failure of the elites. Lack of social recognition and esteem form the bedrock of unrest. Inequality, anytime you have the richest 1% of Americans making more money than the bottom half combined, you are setting yourself up for the opposite of the common good. Mobility is the essence of the American dream, but mobility is no longer as available as we might like to think for everyone. If you're a beneficiary of meritocracy, you know that mobility has helped you. But if you're someone who's trying to crack that ceiling, it's not working for you. FDR hit it on the nose when he talked about the poverty of dignity, where he said the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, it's whether we provide enough for those who have too little. And all he did was get us out of the Great Depression. There is something called meritocratic hubris, that fatal pride, which leads to a diminishing of solidarity. It's a dangerous trend where the winners feel that their success is their own doing without being a part of a greater community. It's a measure of their virtue, and it's easy to look down on those that are less fortunate. And blame has a way of creeping in and replacing empathy. The winners forget that there's always a degree of good luck and good fortune involved. And we should never, ever forget that maxim, there but for the grace of God, or the accident of fortune go on. Merit, unexamined, can become a form of tyranny, where our fellow citizens and our fellow Americans don't get to understand, appreciate, and benefit from the common good. What we're living through right now is a dangerous period where we're suffering through the economics of humiliation for too many people. Globalization has magnified the gap between winners and losers. And we know that college degrees have represented the keys to success in our new economy, but suddenly we're beginning to realize that that's come to the detriment of our blue collar and non-college careers. This idea of plutocratic populism, the notion that the wealthy are the folks that have made it, but they make it appear that they care about the people, that feeds this sense of replacement, frustration, and humiliation. We're going to get to that in a second. So the question is, who makes it on their own? The problem with meritocracy isn't the ideal, but it's our failure to live up to it. An example, the two sisters who were the daughters of the woman that was on the television program who bought their way into Stanford University, is an idea of this notion of meritocracy going back. The parents were paying out big dollars to the admissions department to falsify their records so that they could buy their way into a university. We all know families that have legacies in college admissions. That gives that person a leg up. If you're a legacy in an Ivy League school, you're there. Did you merit the entrance to it? You merited it by winning the birth lottery of being in that family. In a meritocratic society, the winners too often believe that only they earned that success through their hard work and talent. Now, I don't want you to glaze over here, but I just want you to look at the statistic at the top. Since 1989, the top 1% in the United States have seen a nearly 300% increase in their wealth. Since 1980, inequality has increased more rapidly in the US than in Europe. But there's good news. Since 2021, so let's actually take a step back and say this is good news. And this is what should be amplified more and more. Americans have produced almost 8.5 million jobs in 15 months, the strongest job creation in modern history. Unemployment is at 3.6%. Almost 5.5 million small businesses have applied to start this year alone, 20% more than any other year recorded. And as part of a program to distribute technology to the middle of the country, to the rural areas, to bring the country together so that it no longer is flyover states, President Biden and a representative who I'm going to introduce you to in a second, named Ro Khanna from California, have created a program where low-wage earners will get high-speed internet for $30 a month in those flyover states. AT&T, Comcast, Verizon, and 17 other providers will offer discounts. The White House estimates it'll extend it to 48 million households. That's an economic lifeline that gets people, we take it for granted. All of us will go home, if we can wait to get home. You'll hit your phone, you'll have broadband, you'll be off and running. This is a huge, huge step forward. It's a step in creating what is called progressive capitalism. One of the misconceptions about FDR and the New Deal, because liberals and Democrats frequently glorify FDR and the New Deal, is that this was the epitome of government intervention in the economy. And it was, in the sense that the government was very, very active. But the government was not doing it alone in many, many instances. There were certainly government programs, but there were equally a number of public-private partnerships. Did they all work? They did not. But what FDR was a master at was simply saying, if it doesn't work, throw it away and we'll try another one. That's what is meant by progressive capitalism. Ensure universal access to high-quality child care and preschool, equitable distribution of funding for public ed, public health infrastructures, increase minimum wage, remove unfair political restrictions on union growth. When I mentioned just before about the Great Compression and America at its peak from 1945 to 1968, that was also the peak of union membership. It's and middle class America. Next time you hear a politician say we want to build up the middle class, tell them to get out of the way and help unions create stronger contracts and higher salaries for members so that those folks can then feed the pipeline and prime the pump for a stronger economy. And of course, it would be nice if Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk paid their taxes. That's not too much to ask. So what we're looking for isn't necessarily an equality of wealth. We're looking for an equality of condition. Not sure what that is. An equality of condition, meaning lives of decency and dignity that are achievable and recognizable. And this comes from 1931, a guy named James Trustlow Adams, who coined the phrase, the American dream. So now let's go to the next stage. And I want you to pay attention to this gentleman, because I think you're going to hear from him in the next few years. His name is Ro Khanna. He is a representative from California. His district is Silicon Valley. He is tied into Silicon Valley. He is a tech dude, but he's also a brilliant politician. And he wrote a book called Dignity in the Digital Age, which can become a blueprint for a presidential campaign, just saying, in 2024. Never in history, when you're looking at technology and media, has it been possible for so many people to be politically aware and informed, but this creates a big problem. The digital revolution isn't just about information, but we now have choice. And it also means that there's a huge gap between the informed and the uninformed, and the interested and the uninterested. My guess is that the fact that all of you are sitting here or watching on Zoom, wherever you may be, you are tied in, you are tuned in, you pay attention. There are an equal number of Americans that aren't, for a variety of reasons. Many of them are just working really, really hard and are very, very busy and don't have the time to be retired and reading and watching as much as we do. But tech and the media have created and contributed to polarization. The polarized media doesn't just emphasize commonalities, it can unfortunately weaponize differences. It doesn't just focus on the best of the other side, it can also threaten you with the worst of the other side. If you turn into one of those channels, you are going to hear that everybody else is coming for you. And choices are framed by what is called confirmation bias. We have to be, particularly, and all of us, have to be aware of our own confirmation bias. We have to get out of our own comfortable shell, and as hard as it is, click on other sites to see what is being said from the other side. Because if we don't know what's being said or what's being discussed or what's being emphasized, we're not going to be in a position to counter it in an argument or to understand or anticipate what is going to be said. And social media is a whole other world. When people lose trust in institutions, they lose trust in the stories that are told by those institutions. And social media can act as a solvent that just dissolves the bonds that hold us together. Social media networks can protest and overthrow anything. Nihilists love social media because they can blow up everything. It's easy to criticize anything. It's really much more difficult to propose the solution and build it and to be part of the solution. This author, a gentleman named Jonathan Rauch, this is on the reading list. This is a new one, wrote a book called The Constitution of Knowledge, which is a really important concept. And it basically means this: we all together share common knowledge. We all, in our academic careers, growing up in our education, shared the common stories. And whether they were myths, whether they were reality, but we shared these bonds. He says that Western societies, and he calls this an epistemic operating system. So think of your computer and an operating system. This constitution of knowledge is our cultural operating system. Our society is fundamentally evolved by truth and norms. I was actually going to put up a picture of me with ligaments. I see if I could get a picture of my knee, but with ligaments and cartilage. That's the idea of truth and norms. Truth and norms are the cartilage and the ligaments that hold our country together. And this constitution of knowledge relies on an array of delicate social settings and understandings, norms that we've consistently adhered to, but if they're broken, are very, very difficult to regain. I had trouble with this one also. The dangerous rise of disinformation and artificial intelligence. This is a dangerous guy. Steve Bannon in 2018 was out there still today doing lots and lots and lots of mischief, said that the way to deal with the media is to flood the media with, you can see it. The notion very simply is truth does not have any place in the equation. It's all about power. If we destroy norms, if we destroy truth, and if we support this kind of political agenda, we are destroying the constitution of knowledge and the common good. When you add to that the introduction of artificial intelligence, it becomes amazingly, amazingly dangerous, because this leads to a limitless spread of highly believable disinformation. I cringe when I hear someone say, well, I just saw this online, and they come out with an idea, and I'm going, oh my God, where did that come from? Spreading falsehoods, and this is the next thing. It's not just text, images, but the next horizon is deep fake videos. You will see guaranteed videos. It's already happened where you had a video of Nancy Pelosi saying something or other politicians that have been doctored, and it makes it look like they're saying something. It's a deep fake thing. These become inconceivably easy. So we have to be careful about two things here: misinformation and disinformation. And I like to, they're used frequently interchangeably, but I'd like to make a distinction. Misinformation is information that can be conveyed by mistake, or it's a mistaken interpretation. It may be distributed knowingly, but it is a mistake in the source of information. That's misinformation. Disinformation is much more dangerous because it's deliberate. It's a deliberate, misleading statement or untruth. So the Constitution of Knowledge, that's us. We are the Constitution of Knowledge. It's fundamentally an accumulation of these norms and social rules that govern disagreement and lead to knowledge. We use institutions to define reality-based community and the social contract that protects the rights. So how do we avoid this epistemic tribalism, where one tribe talks in untruths and doesn't care about truth, and the other tribe says, but that's not true? We have to focus on resurrecting truth. I really had trouble with some of these pictures. And I can remember the moment that she came out. If you recall the inauguration in January 2017, and Kellyanne Conway was being interviewed by Chuck Todd, who was not one of my favorites, and he was pressing her on the size of the crowd. And they were talking, and she said, well, the crowd was the largest crowd ever for in the history of inaugurations. And he said, no, it wasn't. He says, we have the facts here. And she said, well, we have alternative facts. Stop, full stop, shut down the presses. There is no such thing as alternative facts. But as is wont, he never pressed a follow-up, and they were off and running. There is no such thing as alternative facts. All of us has a responsibility to check for the truth. All of us in public education, because there are many of us who were teachers, we were very, very focused on teaching critical skills, objectivity, check your sources, check your bias. And if you're a media magnet, this quote comes from, you may remember the name, Leslie Moonis, there you go. He was the head of CBS and the creator of that fine television program, Big Brother.
Right.
But during the run-up to the 2016 election, there was a lot of criticism directed at news organizations for covering the circus that was the Trump campaign and never ever fact-checking any of the nonsense that was being broadcast. And when asked about that, Leslie Moonis said, it may not be good for America, but it's good for CBS. That is exactly counter to the Constitution of Knowledge. That's what undermines the common good. And when you hear any political figure talk about the media, and they use the phrase enemy of the people, run for the hills. This sets off bells and whistles. My former Soviet history teachers and professors are probably spitting in their graves, because if you studied anything about Russian or Soviet communism and totalitarian ideologies, if you hear that phrase, if you read 1984, anything to do with George Orwell, enemy of the people, I can't hit you with a bigger bell. That is really a bad thing. So now let's look at politics. My good friend Ezra Klein, why we are polarized. And this book isn't on the reading list, but in the late edition, Seth Bradwell's book, American Schism. We all have to answer a very, very simple question. Who does government serve? Who is government here to serve? Let's start with the 8 o'clock hearing tonight. This is not, as the Republican National Committee would have you believe, legitimate political discourse. the January 6th event, not the committee. The core problem watching this committee hearing tonight is that there are millions of Americans who are going to tune in or not tune in that have three convictions: that they still believe that the election was stolen, that violence is justified, and that the rules and norms that hold our society together do not matter. So what we have is a failure to govern. Apologies to quote him, that quote from the book. Our elites have not governed well for the past 4 decades. I mean, the reality is we've had bad political leadership for decades. Tax cuts and culture wars are not good governance. It doesn't work. And we've had a rise of professional elites, and all that has done has polarized America and led to a dignity gap. And you can see in the signs where it's going. We have now, for all intents and purposes, created a government by degree, by college degree, that is. 95% of House members and 100% of the Senate are college graduates. Just for fun, think back, Harry Truman never went to college, just as a point of reference. The credentialed few govern the uncredentialed many. 2/3 of American adults do not have a college degree. Very few members of the working class are ever elected to federal office. Is it any wonder that there is a seeming disconnect in their mind that there is no one in Washington that is paying attention to them? There may be people telling them that they care about them. Those words are easy to broadcast. The actions are much more difficult to put into play. So what's the difficulty here? Well, the Senate has always been one of the federal government's least democratic institutions, even though historically the phrase is it's the world's greatest. Think about this. Think of the Senate today, and it's always been known as the world's greatest deliberative body. That's when you teach history or political science, the Senate is the world's greatest deliberative body. Really. Each state today, though, there's a major problem. It gets 2 senators. And what we've seen, and this is why I started with the notion of James Madison creating a constitution that was supposed to be fluid. It's a living document. California's 2 senators represent 39 million people. Wyoming's 2 senators represent 581,000. But in the Senate, those votes are equal. It means that the smallest 25 states that are home to 15% of the population have as much power as the 25 biggest states. I don't know about that being the world's premier deliberative organization. And then just for fun, let's throw in the filibuster. The filibuster is just a procedural mechanism that allows the minority party to block legislation from advancing. Now, historically, this has never been a big, let me rephrase it, it's rarely been as big a deal as it has been recently. It's the ability to keep debate open on a legislative item until the Senate votes to close it. That process is called cloture. So if you see that or read it, that's what it means. Closing debate, though, requires 60 votes. And if you don't have 60 votes, you don't get anything done. The filibuster is inherently undemocratic, and most importantly, not required by the Constitution. It's an invention. In fact, it's so unique that Alexander Hamilton wrote about it in general and said, I'll read this quote because it's different vocabulary. If a pertinacious minority can control the opinion of a majority, then the government situation must always savor of weakness. That means the government's going to be in trouble, sometimes bordering on anarchy. That's Alexander Hamilton writing in 1787, describing what we now have happening in our Senate. The filibuster is undemocratic. It empowers the minority to block the will of voters and the American public. Then there's another political party, the Electoral College. We have 8 presidential elections over the past 30 years, with 8 Supreme Court vacancies. Republicans have won the popular vote in 1 of those 8 elections, but got to choose 5 of the 8 new Supreme Courts. But nothing will be done about it because the Senate is hamstrung by the filibusters. So how do we manage America's undemocratic democracy? Well, we have a problem. Polarization is compounded by geography. By 2040, 70% of Americans will live in the 15 largest states. So 70% of Americans will be represented by 30 senators. Sparse rural areas are now politically more empowered. I want you to pay attention, though, to a solution, potentially. It's something called the National Interstate Popular Vote Compact. And this is where states will agree, state legislatures will agree that they will submit all of their electoral votes to the candidate that wins the popular vote nationally. So that if you're in Alabama, excuse me if anybody out there is from Alabama, and the popular vote is won by Joe Biden, your electoral votes will go to the winner of the popular vote. So all the electoral votes will go. Now, to date, states with 196 electoral votes have signed up for that, state legislatures. We need to get to 270. But guess where those remaining votes are located? They are in red states that are certainly controlled by red legislatures. But that is one potential maneuver around the Electoral College. It doesn't require a constitutional amendment. So we have some political recommendations. First, let's achieve equality of voice and representation. Let's enlarge the House of Representatives. We can do that through federal legislation. By increasing the House, we change the Electoral College because each state's Electoral College votes are dependent upon the number of representatives. New York State should get more electoral votes than Wyoming. Well, we do, we should get even more. Introduce ranked choice voting, which means that candidates can't simply pander to their base because they need to get a second or third choice on someone's ballot. Today, and especially in primaries, you have polarization because candidates just basically say whatever the base wants them to say so that they can get that lever pulled. In ranked choice voting, they're going to have to worry about all the potential voters because if they don't get the number one highest amount, they still can win if they have more second and third place votes. So it broadens the need to appeal to more voters. Support adoption through state legislation of independent citizen redistricting commissions. That means revamp gerrymandering. And most important, not most important, but also DC should be a state. It's got almost twice as many people as Wyoming. And then an easy one, let's talk about dark money. I shouldn't say easy. Amend the Constitution to regulate election contributions and spending. It should be a no-brainer. We can do that by way of an amendment. I threw this up just to review because I know all of you are up to speed on how to pass an amendment to the Constitution. All right, 2/3 vote. You can actually now go home and read about that in your pocket. Constitutions can be proposed by 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, or if 2/3 of the states request one, by a convention called for that purpose. Constitutional conventions are not unheard of. Periodically, you will hear rumblings, primarily though from red states, that they want constitutional conventions to redo something on their political agenda. If there's going to be a constitutional convention, this is what I wanted to consider. Election money reform. Let's redesign the Supreme Court. My personal suggestion, this is an easy, well, I'm not sure how easy, but establish the federal legislation fixed terms. There should be term limits for Supreme Court justices. Lifetime appointments just do not work. Address the right to vote and empower voters. Simple. Make Election Day a federal holiday. We need more people voting. We need to make it easier for people to vote, give people more choices about when and where they vote. State level legislation in all states can support implementation of vote centers and early voting. It's an embarrassment when you see on election day people standing in line for 3 and 4 and 5 hours to stand there and vote. In New York, we fortunately take voting, I think, on election day for granted. It's rare that we, has anyone here ever stood in line for 3 hours in New York to vote? It's important. If you go to Georgia, that may happen. Make voting easier and accessible. Let's institute same-day registration and automatic universal voter registration. The easiest thing in the world. You register for a driver's license, you register a car, you register to vote, and you are now a participant in our democratic system. And let's pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds and provide opportunities for them to practice voting. My son teaches government and economics in high school in Maryland, and every single year he runs a voting drive where he registers kids to vote. That is what we should be doing in public schools around the country. And inspire a culture of commitment. A universal expectation of a year of national service. A year of national service is not a bad idea. You've heard kids taking gap years. Well, let's take a gap year for the country. Easy for me to say since I'm not in a year of gap year. Maybe I need a gap year. Expand funding for service programs and fellowships that offer young people paid service opportunities, and invest in more civic education, civic educators, civic programs. In Maryland, the civics program is a full year course. New York State is 1 semester. And unfortunately, for example, in our high school, it was 1 semester senior year. That's not the place to talk about civic education in the spring of senior year for 1 semester. That's not your best audience. If we don't get our house in order, we run a risk, because right now we are confronting an era, an age of strong men. This is a book that should be on the reading list. So if you want to jot down, this guy's name is Francis Fukuyama. For many, many years, he caught a lot of grief because after 1989, the fall of communism and the reunification of Germany, he wrote a book called The End of History. And he said, not to worry, liberal democracy wins, communism loses, it's clear sailing from here. Whoa, he's caught a lot of grief. So he comes back and says, listen, let's recalibrate, let me rethink this. So now he has a book out called Liberalism and Its Discontent, which is a little more even-handed. So what we look at here is that today, right now, if we can't figure out how to do the common good, we have to counter the age of strongmen. In 1945, there were only 12 democracies. By 2002, and this is one of the reasons why Fukuyama wrote that book, The End of History, is there were 92 democracies. It was the first time the number of democracies exceeded autocracies, where a country, state, or society is governed by one person. But 2 years ago, Freedom House now says it's the 15th consecutive year where the number of democratic countries has declined. 73 countries are designated as having less freedom. And guess who's one of those 73 countries? We are. So there's a clear distinction in the chart. Liberal government, and liberal government meaning liberal in the sense of paying attention to social contract and those founding documents, versus illiberal, which means authoritarian. In a liberal government, you have free open elections with multiple candidates, and it's legal. In an authoritarian government, you can vote in Russia. Putin won't have any problem. He's already got the election managed, limited, and control. Free and unfettered media in a liberal society. That's where you have a presidential candidate who has the media and says, write what you want. Not a presidential candidate who says the media is the enemy of the people. That's what you find in an authoritarian or liberal government, where they will call the press and have their supporters jeering the press. In a liberal society, you have courts that are free of political limitations. In an authoritarian government, you jail political opponents and use phrases like lock her up. In a liberal democracy, pluralistic and diverse. In an authoritarian, it's nationalistic and homogeneous. What you have to look for, these are the characteristics of a strong man. By the way, this is Viktor Orban from Hungary. He should look familiar because the Republican Conservative Political Action Committee last month held their convention in Hungary, and he was the keynote speaker. Not all are the same, but they share some common features. If you hear the phrase cult of personality, that's right there with enemies of the people. Contempt for rule of law. They claim to represent the real people against the elites. That notion is referred to as populism. Populism in the 19th century in the Midwest, in Kansas, in Oklahoma, and Nebraska. Those were the populists that were representing the people against the moneyed interests in the railroads. These guys are faux populists who are just getting people riled up because they're afraid of the other. And their politics is driven by fear and nationalism. These strong men leaders want to be regarded as indispensable. They try to convince people that they alone can solve the problems. I almost jumped out of the chair watching the speech at the nomination convention where he looked at the camera and said, I alone can fix this. This could have been George Orwell's worst nightmare. And then when the Republicans ran in 2020, there was no platform. It was literally whatever President Trump says, that's what we're doing. That's what we mean when strong leaders want to be regarded. The distinction between state and leader is diminished, and we all know who our favorite family members are that take on roles in government to ensure stability and the fulfillment of wealth. Let's go get some contracts in China. Let's get some contracts and copyrights in Saudi Arabia. They have contempt for the rule of law. In the current leader in Turkey is a guy named Recep Erdogan. And his statement is, democracy is like a tram that you ride until you get to your destination. Then toss it aside because I'm already in power. Bringing courts under their control to further their personal agenda. The courts are the most important institution for a strong and leader. Look at our Supreme Court right now. And let's think about any of the suggestions I've made about amending the Constitution or challenging certain things like Citizens United. If it has to go to the Supreme Court, guess what? They're the most important institution for a strong man. They pack the courts with sycophants. And Trump says when somebody's president, our authority is total, the laws selectively applied and used as a political tool. There's phony populism. If I could have gotten a little clip from Music Man, this is called the Harold Hill complex. Harold Hill. We have trouble right here with a capital T that rhymes with P, and that stands for populism. It's based upon this political argument known as simplism or simplistic, that there's simple solutions for complex problems. That, by the way, is Erdogan in Turkey. And because there are simple solutions, if it doesn't happen, which it's not going to because it isn't a simple solution, it's due to the fact that there are evil people that are standing in the way. So those who oppose are either stupid or evil. But we will offer you nostalgic nationalism. Now, I want you to pay close attention to this photo because the gentleman on the left, how many of you read Hillbilly Elegy? That is the author, J.D. Vance. He is currently the Republican candidate for senator in the great state of Ohio. For all my friends in Ohio, you have your work cut out. He is Make America Great Again, liberal democracy, they claim has not worked for everyone, but this represents a look backward. It recognizes that inequality can become a potentially powerful political tool that you can leverage into maintaining power. The appeal of that Hillbilly Elegy is that he captured the dichotomy between two Americas, and he is playing up the have-nots. And he's saying, forget the fact that I went to Yale Law, and forget the fact that I went to Ivy League. I really have you at heart. So that's what I call phony populism. And of course, the famous quote, I love the uneducated. So wrapping it up, these are now, stepping aside, personal recommendations. Number one, for all of us, try to avoid confirmation bias and expose ourselves to diverse perspectives. Number two, as much as possible, use the word public. Celebrate the word public. Support anything that has public in it. And as well as support organizations that need to and have democratic small d support, such as Public Citizen, Southern Poverty Law Center, the American Civil Liberties Union. I couldn't fit Southern Poverty Law Center up there. I want you to pay attention, take her name down. This is Professor Heather Cox Richardson. She's an American history professor at Boston College, and she writes a blog that's called Letters from an American. If you Google her, you can subscribe to her newsletter. It's free. What makes it unique is that every day she will give you an overview, not just of what is happening politically in America, but she will put it in a historic context for you, similar to what I was trying to do this evening. And those of us who are teachers, we know our 3 R's. Well, these are my 3 R's. Resist the repeal of rights. Voting rights, women's rights, civil rights, labor rights. Resist the repeal of rights. I joke with friends, I'm a conservative because I want to conserve all of these rights that one party, one radical party is trying to take away as much as possible. And as difficult as it is, and be selective about this, engage. Engage with people that differ and have different perspectives. Be selective. And you may not win 10 out of 10, but you will, somewhere along the line, change someone's mind. And the best way to do that is to ask questions. Don't necessarily go and use the Socratic method as a great tool. When someone you're talking to says, well, I think this, this, and this, instead of immediately countering it and jumping in with, well, you're crazy, and that's not the case, say, well, why? What is it? Explain that to me. That opens the door for a conversation. And every once in a while, it'll work. Remember to ask the follow-up question. And we'll leave you with this. The only thing that can stop a bad politician with a vote is a good citizen with a vote. So for all of you, thank you very much. For all of you who are out in Zoom land, thank you for zooming in. And any questions or discussions? Go.
I agree with everything you said. And I would imagine that 100% of the people will do also. But I was wondering, unfortunately, how we could utilize what you said here in the state of Florida. And go under the supposition that everybody is fair-minded. But it seems to me that the governor of Florida is only interested in himself and what he can do to make himself better. And he's not really interested in helping anybody else unless it helps him. I may be wrong.
Well, I think you have a pretty accurate appraisal of that situation. I would just reiterate the last bullet here: engage and don't see the narrative. It doesn't work as frequently as we would hope, but you can't give up the narrative. I have a college roommate who may be tuning in, I hope, who was from a dyed-in-the-wool Republican family in Cincinnati, and I was able to engage, and there's been a lot of education, and he's then went out and now is engaging his family. So it does happen, but we all have to engage. We all have different forums. We all have different ways and avenues and opportunities. Some are more restricted than others.
What seems to me also, when one deals with someone whose creed is entirely opposite yours, your own personal safety, I think you better think of that.
Oh, that's what I mean when I say you need to be selective.
I know,
Yes.
but I want.
Unfortunately, that's very true.
And it's scary.
And it happens on both sides, because we just saw the story about the guy that was arrested trying to go kill Supreme Court justice.
I don't
So,
know.
yeah. But that's what happens when norms and truth in that Constitution.
Do you have
get
any
shattered.
information on why this gentleman?
I don't know any of the details.
Part of it was abortion rights.
Oh, it was abortion rights?
Yeah. He's against one of your 3 R's. He doesn't want to repeal women's rights.
There you go. There you go. It's a real thing, and that's what I mean when I say be judicious and selective in how we approach it. But we can't see the narrative by subscribing and listening and participating in all these sources. That's what we're doing. Yes,
I want to
ma'am.
thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
When I believe is it Hannah Nicole Smith or Hannah Nicole Jones, who wrote the original article
Jones.
in the New York Times Magazine.
Right.
One of the topics that she focused on in that was reparations.
Yes.
And she said things in that article that just blew my mind. One of which was that during the Homestead Act, late 1880s or something, we allowed white Europeans to benefit from that act, and we did not allow Black Americans to benefit from that. The same thing with the after World War II, with the creation of places like Levittown. And so she made the case, and it really made me think that there are when you talk about white privilege, we just take these things for granted. We take for granted the fact that many of our ancestors were able to buy property and therefore benefit in terms of the future generations. And we took that right away from Black Americans,
You're
on
absolutely
whose
right.
backs we built this country.
That is, well, you touched on a couple of things. The basic premise is that is the ultimate example of caste.
Yes.
Secondly, when people hear the word reparations, it immediately rings bells and alarms and things of that nature, because the easy hook is to say we're not going to give checks of $50,000 to every Black person in America. Reparations could simply mean, as we put up here and discussed earlier, more opportunity, more avenues to improve economic conditions.
Low interest loans,
Uh,
building
to-
up communities.
It's a recognition that not everyone was at the same starting line. Think of that in your mind, watching, you've all seen in the Olympics when we have track and field and the sprints, and they're all starting at different starting points. That's what race has done in America. And that's what caste does in America, has done in America. So reparations would simply mean finding a way to put everybody at the same starting line to give, as we put up there, equal opportunity. And that's what that 1619 project is all about. Yes.
In terms of the disinformation, I was wondering, is there anything that we could do in terms of getting the truth out and not allowing so many lies? I mean, when you look at Fox or something, they've got, they're telling everybody how they're not even going to broadcast tonight's hearings. And, they let people say the most outrageous things on there. What happened to like the FCC used to be able to tell you that you weren't supposed to curse or you weren't supposed to have anything but single beds, so I Love Lucy. I mean, now all of a sudden we could just say whatever we want and it's just doesn't matter.
You know,
Give people time.
Yes, in the late 1980s, in the Bush administration, the fairness doctrine was repealed.
Yeah.
And fairness doctrine used to be, we all grew up with this, you'd watch a news show and you'd have to have a countervailing program or point counterpoint to speak on. Not only did it eliminate that, but it also eliminated restrictions on how many media outlets any one person or group could control in a specific market, which opened up the floodgates for Myrdal and that kind of magnet. So the answer to your question is how can we control that disinformation is an open question. Because of at its base level, the technology piece. The technology piece, when you look at Mark Zuckerberg and the nonsense and the utter fiasco that is Facebook, and the disinformation that's propagated that way, and other social media, and we're not even familiar with what the fringe elements are looking at as far as social media is concerned. So and that's why I put up Ro Khanna's book, Dignity in the Digital Age, that congressman from California. He has various connections and plans working together with tech companies. You can't do this without tech Silicon Valley being on the same page. They all have to be working together. And that also includes working with our government on something as simple as national security issues. There have been instances where Bill Gates and Apple have refused to cooperate with the National Security Agency on national security issues because they don't want to give away proprietary technology information that can help them decipher a Russian nuclear attack. So at its base level, I think the answer would be until we can get the technology to safeguard and promote the truth, we all just have to be hyper-vigilant in trying to determine and find as much as we can to promote it. I forget the adage that it takes the truth so long to get somewhere, but a lie goes around the world overnight. Something like that. Yeah, so that I think the answer there lies with technology, and right now we have to find a political connection. And I think that Ro Khanna may have some interesting ideas that should go.
There was an article in the Washington Post that said something to the effect there are at least 12,000 local newspapers that deal with totally alternative facts. And that they were run by this group or that.
Sure. There are two problems to that coin, two sides to that coin. Number one is you have the proliferation of news organizations that traffic in disinformation. This other side or flip side of that coin is the fact that you have the disappearance of local newspapers and other news sources that used to be the foundation of the constitution of knowledge, that used to bring people together because we all share the same space. We share the same reality, our community. So when you eliminate, look at the Times Herald Record, when you eliminate the Record as a local paper, which doesn't even publish on Saturdays, and then you combine that with other mega news organizations that are trafficking in disinformation, it's an unbelievably uneven contest.
It even goes one step further. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio. The Youngstown Vindicator folded after 150 years of one newspaper town. When I grew up in Youngstown, 175,000 population. The population now is 62,000 when the steel mills left. But that presents a real problem for the dissemination of information and political information.
Exactly.
And when that begins to proliferate throughout the country, we're really preventing groups of people from the dissemination, from getting the information. And I was heartsick when I discovered that. But I mean,
Well, the good news is that good folks of Youngstown are sending Tim Ryan up to run for Senate against J.D. Vance.
Yes.
So I hope they give him a real good luck.
Speaking of hope, Tony, do you believe we still have reason for hope?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's why we do these. And the fact that we have President Biden is case in point, that he won the popular vote 2 years ago, that there are enough Americans who could see through and continue hopefully to see through.
I just want to share a little happy note. When there was a Saturday afternoon when we got the word that Biden had won the election, I was walking on the rail trail in Hurleyville, and it was the most amazing thing to watch because we all had phones with us and we were getting these notifications, and up and down the trail, you heard people cheering. And it was, I mean, I get chills right now retelling this story, but it was a wonderful moment.
Let's leave on that positive note.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Guys, whoever's in the back office, I think that concludes our short.
We'll see that.